Hello all. So today we are going to explore a very interesting topic, practical Splunk administration in 2 hours. And as you can see, within 2 hours, you will become quite proficient with Splunk administration task. And you can also see on the right hand bottom side, I have given you some of the details. You can reach me on Telegram using my username. And I have also created one particular Telegram group, Splunk Workshops, where I publish a lot of schedules with respect to the Splunk training. So before I really go forward, I wanted to emphasize on one particular aspect. So always have a look at my YouTube video description box. Description box. Why? Because in the video description box, the first thing is I always post a GitHub link, and my GitHub page basically hosts a lot of resources, including SPL queries and any kind of the PPTs or PDF files, which I will be representing, right? So it might be helpful. The third thing is I'm also posting a timeline. So for example, if you really wanted to follow along, or if you are interested in following certain topics, you can follow the timeline. So, and I'm readily mentioning the timeline with respect to the all the sections and the course curriculum, right? So, and one more thing before I get started. So I would highly recommend, if you really wanted to see my video. So for example, I have also, I'm the creator of one more video, CyberSecNerd, Practical Splunk Zero to Hero. So in this particular course, I'm talking about what is the structure of the SPL queries, and I have got a lot of demonstration. So it is from the perspective of the Splunk user and the Splunk Power user, right? And this is the progression for that particular course itself. And so that's it about the introduction, and I will see you in the entire course. Thank you. Hello all. In this course, we are going to discuss about practical Splunk administration in 2 hours. So we are going to work with a lot of configuration files and indexes. We are also trying to understand Splunk admin basics as well as license management. So in the overview, I'm going to take you through all the responsibilities which are intended to be performed by the Splunk Enterprise administrators. And I will be taking you through the enterprise components as well, including indexers, search heads, heavy forwarders, and the universal forwarders as well. And I will also be talking you through various licensing options, and I will also be talking about how to handle license violations as they occur within our enterprise. So the first thing first, I will be taking you through a day in Splunk Enterprise Administrator's life. So this is how it is. And first of all, we are going to distinguish between the Splunk Enterprise System Administrators and the Splunk Enterprise Data Administrators. So both have a different kind of the responsibilities, and therefore I will be taking you through that. So the Splunk Enterprise System Administrator task, if you see on my screen, so we are going to start with the installation of Splunk software. We are going to create and manage indexes. Then we are also responsible for managing Splunk licenses. And then with respect to the configure security, we will be creating multiple roles and assign it to the various individuals with the help of the roles or groups. And then I will be taking you through how to monitor Splunk and respond to the monitoring console related alerts. If I were to give you an overview, how does a data administrator task differ from the system administrator task? This is how it is. So they are responsible for creating and managing various type of the inputs. This might include checkpoint related log ingestion or cloud related log ingestion into the Splunk. So variety of the log input. We are responsible for configuring a variety of the data inputs within the Splunk platform. Okay. So we are also responsible for how to configure a line breaking and timestamp. As you know that we are also responsible for installation of various Splunk add-ons, third-party add-ons, which is responsible for line breaking or parsing the various log-related formats into the Splunk platform, right? So the parsing, the extraction of the fields, so those kind of the job will fall under the data administrator task as well. So as I said, we are responsible for designing and managing the entire ingestion pipelines, and we will also be managing some of the configuration files, including props.conf, transforms.conf for an example. And then we will also be looking at collaborating with the users as well for the data onboarding or ingestion into the Splunk platform. So in the next video, I will take you through Splunk Enterprise components. Hello all, in this section, we are going to talk about Splunk Enterprise components. So let's get started. So this is how the bird eye view looks like for the Splunk platform. So we have got our machines from which we will be collecting data into the Splunk platform. These can be your containers. These can be your servers. These can be your network devices, for example. And all the data is getting ingested into your Splunk platform. And then we have a search head, which uniquely offers a user interface where we can perform various searches as well, right? So three core components. So before we get started, so these are the essential components. So first we will be talking about the indexer. So indexer is one of the Splunk components which is responsible for collecting and receiving all the logs and parsing those particular logs, as well as this is where the logs will be getting stored for the longer duration of the time depending on your data retention policy. So for example, 90 days logs will be getting stored here, 365 days logs will be getting stored here in the indexers, right, for the long-term duration. Then the search head, as we talked about, it's a unique user interface which offers so that you should be able to run various searches or search jobs, and which will give you a result in a statistical manner or in some of the charts and things of that nature. And then we have universal forwarder. So universal forwarder are nothing but these Splunk agents with the help of which data is being collected from the machines, right, in the raw format. So this is how in the bird eye view looks like. So for example, we have got various applications. These applications might be running on your Unix or Linux system or your Windows server for that matter. And if depending on what kind of the operating system which we are using, if we are using Windows, we can basically we should be able to configure what we call it as Windows event log forwarding. And if we are using Linux as a platform, we should be able to use a syslog as a process which collects all the data from your machines. And then we can also, so on these particular machines, which we are calling as universal forwarders, which are nothing but the servers again, we will be installing the universal forwarder binary, which is responsible for forwarding your logs eventually into the indexers, right? So this is how it happens. So now you can see at the second level, these are nothing but the indexers where the logs will be getting stored uh, in the form of the index files or the flat files, we can say. So when we perform any kind of the searches, those kind of the search jobs will be getting distributed to the indexers. And as you know, this is a search head where all these Splunk users or Splunk Power users will be performing all day-to-day operations, right? Let's talk about some other components as well. So as you can see, we will be discussing all those components: license master, deployment server, cluster master, search head deployer, monitoring console, and heavy forwarder. So first we will start with the licensing master. So the one instance will be called as a licensing master, and other instances, for example, the indexers or the search heads, so they will be acting as a license slaves as well, right? So license master job is to calculate or perform or run the licensing meter. So it calculates licenses with respect to your daily data ingestion, or it also allocates license as per the Splunk component role it is performing. For example, with respect to the indexer, with respect to the heavy forwarder, things of that nature. But however, this license master job or whatever the daemon we are running, it's a lightweight process, and therefore we can also this process can also reside along with the other Splunk instances like monitoring console. Then we have what we call it as the deployment server. So deployment server is nothing but is one of the way by which we manage a lot of universal forwarders. So universal forwarders in your environment can be hundreds or can be thousands depending on your environment. So how we can manage all the configuration files in the universal forwarder? So we always do with the help of what we call it as deployment server. And these universal forwarders are nothing but the deployment clients. And just to manage those deployment clients or universal forwarders from the deployment server console, we normally make a use of this particular configuration file, which we call it as server class.conf file. At the same time, we can also distribute this configuration files to the distribution or deployment clients with the help of other configuration management tools like Ansible, Puppet for that matter. But Splunk basically recommends a deployment server over the other configuration management tool. Yeah. Then we have what we call it as cluster master. So always remember, depending on your Splunk environment, you will have multiple instances of the indexers. So for example, you can have 16 instances of the indexers or 72 instances of the indexers, depending on how large your Splunk environment looks like. So cluster master manages all of your indexers, right? So always remember that all the instances of indexers are managed by cluster master. So whatever the changes which we will be performing with respect to the conf file or .conf files, we should be making those changes into the cluster master so that all those particular changes will be reflected into the multiple instances of the indexers which our environment might have. Okay, so just remember that. Then what we have is nothing but the search head deployer. So apart from the indexer cluster, we also have a search cluster. Okay, so depending on how many search jobs can be run concurrently, you might have, let's say, 6 instances of the search heads, and these instances will be managed by what we call it as the search head deployer. Okay, search head deployer. So whatever the changes we will be making to the search head deployer, so it again manages all the configuration files on the various instances of the search heads. You can understand like this. Yeah. Then we have monitoring console. So just remember this monitoring console is important from the standpoint of uh, a Splunk system administrators. So where we will be monitoring all the resource utilization, for example, your compute, your memory, your storage on the indexer instances mainly, or the search head instances mainly. We will be monitoring all those particular metrics here, and we can also configure or enable various alerts using monitoring console instance as well, so that we will be alerted if the threshold limit of 80% of the storage has already been reached. That is one of the example of the metric. Okay. Then we also have what we call it as heavy forwarder. Heavy forwarder, you can again understand, it is again responsible for parsing of a lot of data into the some of the usable log format so that the fields can be extracted, right? So it basically offloads some of the compute or workload from the indexes, right? So we can have heavy forwarder in between your universal forwarder and the indexer and your indexes, right? So here we can basically make a use of heavy forwarder so that it can parse a lot, it can do a lot of parsing with respect to your log related data, and then eventually send it to the indexers client. So it is basically offloading some of the work from the your indexers instances. Okay. In the subsequent video, we are going to talk about Splunk licensing options. So let's do. Hello all. In this section, we are going to talk about a Splunk licensing option. So let's go from here. So as we have already discussed, the license is being calculated based on the amount of the data that is being ingested into the Splunk platform before the parsing pipeline, right? So let's try to understand that even more. So just, so these are the types of the Splunk licenses. You have the enterprise license, you have free license, you have trial license. We'll try to discuss about these licenses in a bit. So if you're talking about the enterprise license, this is what is being useful or what is there for all the enterprises to use. So you have got all the features enabled, for example, clustering and distributed search. At the same time, you are getting the no enforcement license, which means you should still be able to perform all of your searches into the Splunk platform even after the license violation, right? So moving on, so then we have got free license as you see. So there is a daily limit the amount of the data which we can ingest into the Splunk platform. You can see it's 500 MB per day. And then we are disabling a lot of features into the free license. For example, clustering, authentication, distributed search, alerting, and deployment management is not available. Then we also have got something known as trial license. So you have got all the full features for the Splunk for the first 60 days, and post that the other features might be disabled, and then your free license, your trial license will be converted into the free license. Then we have got some other licenses with respect to the IoT, and we have also got forwarder related license. So you are not really getting charged for forwarder related license. So as we already know that universal forwarder job is to just collect data and forward it to the indexers. It's just a binary that needs to install onto the instance, which is acting as a universal forwarder. Then again, we also have got one more license type, which is the last category, which is nothing but the dev and test license. And this is for the non-prod environments. And as you can see that it is mainly used for Splunk app development, right? Cannot be really used for the production related environments. So the first, whatever the data which we are ingesting into the Splunk platform, that is something that has to be considered. So the daily ingestion volume, I would say, daily ingestion volume, and what doesn't really comprise of the daily ingestion volume. So full size of the data that is flowing through the parsing pipeline, right? So for example, as we have discussed that there might be a heavy forwarder which might do a lot of parsing before the data is getting indexed into the indexer, right? So the data which is getting dropped from the heavy forwarder as a result of the parsing will not let me repeat. So whatever the data that is going to the heavy forwarder, and I am saying that there might be some kind of the parsing that might happen at the heavy forwarder instance itself. So some of the data might be getting dropped at the heavy forwarder level as well. So this might not constitute to whatever the data that is being indexed in the indexers, right? So it will not contribute to the your daily ingestion volume, right? So we are not really talking about that disk storage. So that basically depends how much of the data, or that also depends on your data retention policies. So that is not taken into consideration. We are also not taking into consideration the replicated data because we might be running multiple instances of the indexes or indexers instances, and therefore we are not taking into consideration the replicated data as well. Then we have also got summary indexes for the data models. So whatever the data that are being stored in the summary indexes, that also doesn't constitute to the daily ingestion volume. At the same time, we have got internal logs, Splunk internal logs. We have already we do know that there are four indexes which are responsible for Splunk internal logs. It also doesn't constitute towards the daily ingestion volume. And metadata with respect to all those things will also not contribute to the daily ingestion license quota. Okay. So you can also see, so what happens here is, so we basically have one of the licensing file which is getting installed in your license master. At the same time, what happens is in the slave, we have got one particular configuration file, we call it as server.conf, which is pointing towards the licensing file which we have installed into the licensing master. And all this particular file, we will do the configuration and pointing towards the whatever the file which we have installed into the license master. So all those other instances will be acting as license slaves. Okay. So in the subsequent section, we'll be looking at managing license violations. In this section, we are talking about how to manage a license violation. So let's go from here. So for example, you can see that. So for example, if I were to assume that I have got 2.5 terabytes of data can be ingested in my Splunk enterprise environment daily, right? So for example, if this particular limit has breached or exceeds this particular 2.5 terabytes of the data, that may comprise a warning, right? So if I got five or more warnings in a 30-day rolling period, that basically comprise a violation. And since we have got non-enforcement license, that we mean by that is your searching will not be getting disabled in that particular period, right? So that is something important. You can see the license warnings. Either you can monitor that in your monitoring console. At the same time, you can also navigate to the licensing page as well to see how many violations are there. So these are either of the three ways you can utilize to monitor the license warnings. So how do you manage any kind of the warnings or violations which you may get from your quota once your licensing quota limit has already been breached, right? For example, important point to remember is in the midnight, your daily ingestion volume limit will be getting restored once again. But at the same time, if you have got a more license requirement, you can basically collaborate with the Splunk organization team as well, or with your organization to buy more license. At the same time, you can stop any kind of the ingestion for one of the data sources, so that you will stay within the capacity of your ingestion volume quota. Okay. So I will be delving into the demo from the subsequent section onwards, and so just stay tuned with me. So in this section, we are going to look at working with Splunk configuration files. So let's start. So in the overview, I'm going to cover index time, search time, and I will be taking you through the precedence of the configuration files, and we will delve into the use case of btool as a tool to troubleshoot, because it is one of the very important arsenal for the Splunk administrators. And we will try to understand the configuration files. We will try to understand the structure. We will also be looking at how does the layering of configuration files look like. Okay. So without a further ado, let us start. So as from the administrator perspective, I would say, the Splunk platform is all about how you manage your configuration files, how you manage your text-based configuration files. So this is pretty much about the Splunk configuration files, as you can see. So there are some of the important points to note here. I mean, so first thing is, so I would like to point out to some of the important details which we might have. So all the files with respect to the configuration files are located in the Splunk home directory. And I want to mention, if you are making the use of Linux-based system, opt/Splunk. So this is your home directory, right? So almost this is which is referencing to your Splunk home directory, right? And under that, your etc directory will be located, right? And then in the second line, you can see there are certain examples. At the same time, you must have heard about inputs.conf. Then you have indexers.conf. So indexers.conf file. So all these particular file are example of the configuration files in Splunk. So also want to point out, so whatever the changes we normally make from the Splunk user interface is also eventually ended with effecting those changes into the configuration file. So always remember, we can in fact make changes using the REST API of the Splunk, and therefore it will affect those changes into the configuration files of the Splunk. Okay. So also want to point out it configuration files constitute stanzas and the key value pairs, and I will give you lot of examples with respect to that in this section, right? So before I go further, there are two Splunk software packages and we are going to look at those. So now you can understand, or you can really look at, so there are two packages. One is the Splunk Enterprise package, which almost constitute everything, right? So for example, it has indexer, search head, license master, deployment server, cluster master, search head deployer, monitoring console, and heavy forwarder. So this Splunk Enterprise binary, which you normally download, constitute of every Splunk component as well, right? And the second binary, which you can see here, Splunk Universal Forwarder, it is just a deployment client, or you can also understand like, it is a Splunk agent, which is meant for collecting a lot of raw data. Okay. So this slide is very, very important, and I really wanted to make sure that you understand this particular perspective. So first of all, our Splunk home is nothing but I'm talking about Linux-based system, and normally we have a Splunk installation in the Linux-based system only if we are talking about the enterprise, right? So Splunk Home references to OPT Splunk, and then we have got multiple directories, okay? So under OPT Splunk, we might have, I will say OPT, I will say Splunk. Under that, this particular directory is their bin directory. So bin directory, you might have seen some of the commands like which you might end up using uh, normally in your day most of the time. So for example, Splunk start, Splunk status, Splunk stop. So all these particular commands, in fact, btool is also one of the command which is also resided under this bin directory, right? So we are going to look at btool command and the use case of that as well, right? And similarly under the etc apps, so if you are talking about apps directory, so any installation you will do. So for example, we know that enterprise security is also one of an app, and then we also have Splunk add-on for AWS, right? So all these particular apps, once we install these particular applications, whether from the command line or from the user interface, it's end up creating the directories under the app directory itself. So just remember that particular thing. So user is always about the user context. I'm not going to talk much about that at this point in time. And then the system directory is also very, very important, right? So under the system directory, there are two things which are very, very important, I would say. Yeah. One is the default directory and one is the local directory. So I'm going to talk about both the directories as well. And then we also have a var directory where we have a lib directory and we have all the indexes. So normally we have main index and we can basically create other indexes as well. So for example, index which might correspond to the network related sources, index which might conform to the AWS, which might conform to the other cloud related resources, things of that nature. Okay. So let's try to understand what we are saying here, okay? So I'm going to talk about the precedence of all the applications. And so let's try to understand the precedence of the application, right? So we have index time precedence. So when we say index time, so we are talking about the time at which the data is getting indexed into the Splunk platform at the indexer level, right? So how does the precedence look like at the index time? So always remember that, so this is our OPT Splunk. This is our home directory. And under then we have already talked about various directories, but under etc, we have already seen that under etc system, there are two important directories. One is default, one is local, right? So want to mention here, so this is when we do the Splunk installation, the default, all the files with respect to the configuration files are getting resided or stored here in the default directory. And we can create all the custom related conf files under the local directory, right? So when we are doing the Splunk upgradations, all the files under the default directory will be getting written here under the default directory. Just understand that. And from our custom deployment standpoint, if we really want to make sure that extraction is happening in a way it should be, so we are making changes into the props.conf file. So all those particular changes we should be doing under the local directory. Just remember this particular thing, okay? So changes we should be doing always under the local directory. So now talking about this, the first preference will go to the system local, okay? And the second preference will go to your applications in a ASCII, I would say ASCII chronological order, I would say, or lexicographical order, right? So for example, if I go to the apps directory, I have got three apps. One is Unix, the second is search, and the third is Buttercup. So as you can see that, local directory will always take a precedence over the default directory. Therefore, the first precedence will always be system local, but the second precedence under the apps directory as we go from the lexicographical order. So this particular application will come second, and then we have a local directory for the search application. Then we have a local directory for our Unix application under the local directory, and then we will come back to the default directory under the application context, and again a default directory under the search application, and it will go like that, right? So always remember the index time precedence, and this is how the precedence looks like. So I will talk about this precedence much more in the subsequent slides. Just remember that. So would like to highlight some of the other things with respect to the Splunk configuration files. So now you can see that this is an example of indexes.conf file where we normally configure a lot of policies with respect to the data retention, right? So we'll anyways talk about those in the subsequent section as well, but just wanted to point out. So the first thing is this is nothing but which is highlighting this is the stanza, right? So all those particular changes will be pertaining to this particular stanza, which is named as default. And then we can see the key value pairs here. We can see the key values pair here. And all the changes which will be affecting corresponding to this particular index, which is named as IDX. And again, you can see the key value pair like this. So from the configuration file perspective, stanza is important. So this is the stanza, and then you can also see the key value pairs. Okay, so we will be going into the details. What does those key value pair mean in the subsequent sections? So there are two ways of learning Splunk configuration files, right? And I think it is very, very important. So the first one is the README files. So let me highlight. So the README files is the first way of doing it. And the second is you can always go to the Splunk documentation, and I'm going to show you both of them as well. So this is how the screenshot, what you can see. So just give me a second. So I hope I have a connection not terminated. Yeah, so my connection is already there. So what I'm going to do here is, so let me try to increase the size. Let me try to clear my screen. So now what I'm going to do next is, so let me go to the cd etc directory, which we are talking about. If I try to do ls, now I'm going to point out some of the things which are very, very important from our perspective, right? So we always go under the, so from our standpoint, there are two directories which are very, very important. So one is the local directory. Where is the local directory? I'm not able to find out that directory. So one is the system directory, which is very, very important. Another directory which is important from our perspective is the local directory. So should be somewhere here, but anyways, so never mind. So what I'm going to do next is let's go to the systems directory. Okay. If I try to do ls once again, now you can see under system, we have got both the directories which are very, very important, default directory and the local directory, right? And at the same time, you are also able to see this particular readme directory, so which we were talking about in the current slide, right? So if I go back here in my previous slide, so these are the readme files located here in this directory, right? So what I'm going to do next here is if I go to readme directory, and if I try to clear my screen, if I say ls, now you can see that all the readme files are here in this particular path, which you are able to see here, right? So now what I'm going to do is, so let's try to have a look at some specific example. I will say less, and let's say what does props file look like, right? So I will say specification. Okay, so this is the file, right? So it shows you everything, right? What does this props.conf file constitute of? And you can have a look at anything, for example. So for example, if I really wanted to see what do we mean by max events, it will show you. So here you can see that, this is the attribute which we are interested in. So under the props.conf file, this is the one of the attribute, which we might be uh, making the use of. So you can see the maximum number of the input lines to add any events. So props.conf file is normally useful for, the data parsing or field extraction perspective, right? So we'll be talking about this props.conf file little more, but you can always have a reference from your README files. And for example, if you really want to understand one more attribute, I will like to give example. If I say uh, truncate, right? So this is again one of the attribute, so I'm trying to search, okay, what does the truncate attribute or parameter look like in the props.conf file? At the same way, what I'm going to do next here is, so if I go here and this is my Splunk interface, and if I say props. So if I click here, now I have already been redirected to the Splunk documentation page, right? So you can also bookmark this particular link, documentation Splunk. And in this particular file, I am again able to see the similar kind of the content. And for example, if I really wanted to find out the max events, so you can see that, so both. are giving me the same content. So whether it's up to you whether you really wanted to reference this particular web page link, or if you really wanted to read those particular content from one of the files resided under the readme directory, right? So getting back to the presentations once again. So we'll be covering layering the Splunk configuration file in the consecutive section, right? So we'll see you there. Hello all. In this section, we are going to discuss about layering Splunk configuration files. So two things very important. So for example, we are definitely going to discuss precedence, which is very important. Why local takes precedence over default. That is first thing. And the second thing is if the same kind of the parameters are defined in the multiple configuration files, how does that particular merge file look like, right? Merging of configuration files on files. So these are the two things which are very important, and we'll try to demonstrate with an examples. Okay. So before I do that, want to describe the Splunk app. Splunk app is nothing but the way, or we can say it's a collection of the configuration files. It's a collection of the scripts. So I would like to give you an example. If I go back to my console just here. So for example, you can, hopefully my connection is still there. If I clear my screen, if I ls, now you can see that I am under the etc apps directory, and you can see all the applications which I have installed or have already been installed as a part of the Splunk enterprise installation. So first app, you can see it's nothing but the search app, which is the default app, comes with the Splunk enterprise installation. And this is, I've also installed a Splunk technology add-on for AWS as well. So if I navigate to these directories, you can see, so for example, if I go to cd Splunk, if I say ta. So if I try to ls, you can see that this particular add-on, Splunk add-on for AWS, is nothing but the collection of the application. If I go to the default directory, should be able to see that this particular add-on is nothing but the collection of various configuration files. And similarly, I can try to get into the configuration of this files. If I say inputs, should be able to see all the parameters. You can see that for this particular source type, all the attributes, AWS Cloud Trail, these are nothing but the attributes. Similarly, for AWS Cloud Watch, these are nothing but the key value pairs, right? Key value pairs. So this is something, and let me go back to my presentation once again. So this is what we are discussing, and we are saying under etc apps, all the applications will be getting installed. Okay. So talking about a little bit about the search and reporting application, we already know this application is coming from the default enterprise default Splunk enterprise installation, and this is the path under which all the configuration files corresponding to the search and reporting app will be residing. Okay. So let's try to understand the structure as well. So for example, you can see that etc apps have already shown you how does it look like if I try to log in into the Splunk server using a command line interface. How does it look like? So under bin directory, always talked about, all the scripts will be there. Under the default directory, this is where when I try to install any kind of the application, all the conf files will be written in the default directory. All the customized configuration I should be keeping under the local directory. Okay. Some of the differences which might be important to understand. So as the first difference is, so default. So all the configuration files under the default directory will be shipped with the Splunk Enterprise package, and all the custom configuration which may correspond to the Splunk specific enterprise will be there under the local directory, right? So if we are doing the Splunk upgrade, all the files under the default directory will be overridden. Okay, but all the configuration under this directory, under the local directory, will be preserved. Okay. At the same time, we should never update any kind of the files under the default directory. Just remember that. We should always modify our files under the local directory. Okay. And so, and always, so the local will always take precedence over default. Okay. Just remember that. So all the configuration file locations. So the first is nothing but the system default, system local. Then you can also see under apps, we have search default. similarly local as well. And this is nothing but one particular application, I would say, default and local. And then you can also say under the user context as well. So these are all the configuration file locations which we might want to look at. Again, a word of caution there. You should never update files in a default directory, right? Understand, quite important to understand. Let's try to understand the precedence of the configuration files once again, because it is very, very important to understand that. So the first thing is when a file or when the data is getting ingested into the Splunk platform, we call that particular time is the index time. When the data is being read from the Splunk platform, we call it as a search time. Okay. So search time is more relevant from the user or application perspective. I would skip this and we'll try to come back if it is important. So you can see that, when we are talking about index time preference, always I would say the system local is the mother of all the directories, because this will take the most precedence as compared to the other directories. And I would say your system default will be taking a last precedence. Always remember this. Okay. So from the apps perspective, we are always talking about the alphabetical or the lexicographical precedence. So for example, A comes first and the search comes afterwards that, right? So here I would say my app one is representing the Unix application. Okay, just cut this because this is a mistake on my slide. So just understand this application as a Unix application, and S comes before, then comes U, right? So for example, if I am trying to make sense of the lexicographical character, your search application will take first precedence over the Unix application, and therefore the second preference will be under search local. The third preference will be under Unix local. Okay, just try to understand that, and then you can give precedence to the default directory as well. So we will also be looking at if there are two parameters which are defined under the two configuration files that have got a conflicting settings, what will happen then? Okay. So this is how it looks like. In the previous slide, I have done a little bit of the mistake. So this is how the configuration looks like. The first will be system local, that is mother of all the repositories, and system default will be the last configuration. Since we are talking about the alphabetical and lexicographical character, the local search local will be taking a second precedence. Unix Unix local will be taking a third precedence. Then we will have search default. Then we will have Unix default, and then we have a system default. Okay. Search time precedence. So just remember that particular thing, which is very, very important. So when we are talking about search time precedence, we are talking about when the file is being read for the system, right? So that is important. And therefore, the user context will become important. So the user context or the application which user is making the use of will be gaining more precedence. And therefore, the first precedence will be under the user context. And if the user is using this application one or search application, then it will be given first precedence and even more precedence as compared to the system local and default. Okay. So you can see that, this is the mother of all the directories when we are talking about the index time precedence. But when we are talking about search time precedence, it is almost getting to the very last of it, right? So two things are very, very important in this particular slide. So I have already talked enough about that local takes precedence over default. And then we will also try to understand with an examples if there is a conflict and how can precedence be applied, which will make more sense when I am trying to demonstrate in the subsequent section. Okay. So this is how it is. So this is one of the example which I would like to demonstrate. So what I'm saying is, so this is the first props.conf file. You can see the path etc apps and CyberSecNerd is nothing but one of the application, you can say. So under local props.conf, and this is the second props.conf file, and this is the third props.conf file. So there are three locations in which we have props.conf file, and how the configurations are coming from these files, which we will try to understand. Okay, so this is nothing but the stanza. And these are nothing but the attributes. So when I say, so now the props.conf file, all the configurations are getting merged in this particular file, which you have seen on the right hand side. So the first two lines are coming from, you can see the first two lines are coming from this particular stanza. Okay, the third line is basically coming from here, which is coming from this particular stanza db.log. Okay, so the third line is coming from this web.log category is equal to web. So at last we will say it's the union, right? It's the union of all the configurations. Just understand the file, the props.conf file, which will be seeing at the runtime is the union of all the configuration if there is not a conflict. Okay, I'm trying to say it once again. And the application, this particular configuration is definitely coming from here, and this configuration is definitely coming from here. Just understand the first two lines are coming from here, and the third line is coming from here, right? This third line is coming from the web category. So this is an example of at the runtime, it's the union of all the files unless there is a conflict. Okay. So this is the second example which I'm trying to demonstrate. Okay. So again, you can see this is the first limits.conf, this is the second, this is the third. So all the limits.conf files are residing in the different locations. So so in the first example, we have seen it is the union of all the configuration unless there is a conflict, right? It's a union unless there is a conflict. There is a conflict, okay? So it's always a union of the configuration unless there is a conflict. So for example, now I can say the first, so if you see here, these first two attributes or the first two key value pairs are coming from here, okay? And now what I'm seeing is, so this particular attribute, the first occurrence is here, the second occurrence is here. Now, since there is a conflict between the two, which will be taking up precedence. So for example, now you can see that the first file is nothing but etc app cyber limits app, and the second is system local. So I always say, you know, your system local, the file which is residing under the system local will be taking up precedence over apps directory, right? Over the apps directory. And therefore, this is what you can see as a consequence of what I have defined here. Just understand this thing, okay? It's just one of the advice, you know, so whatever the attribute that might be important from your perspective, just try to take that particular configuration. Do not copy paste the entire file, okay? So this is an example. So what I'm saying is, so now you know that I really wanted to override this particular attribute. So I need not copy the entire text from this particular file. I just need to define this particular attribute, which will take a precedence because it is defined under the system local and this is under the system default. I need not copy paste the entire stanza. I just need to copy this particular key value pair or this particular attribute, which will be overriding the configuration under the system default. So that's it. In the subsequent section, I will be demonstrating the use of btool, how you can, how the administration can effectively make a use of btool to troubleshoot various configurations. Hello guys, so in this section as promised, we are going to look at btool and how it makes the Splunk administrator job much easier, right? What I'm going to do next is, so first of all, let's discuss about what is btool. So we know that btool is nothing but the Splunk command. We also know that it is a one of the script which resides in the bin directory. We also know it helps in retrieving any kind of the Splunk configuration which resides in one of the conf files. And then you can also have a look. I'm underlining this is the syntax. So without a further ado, let's start with our demonstration, right? So so this is an example and I will try to show you. So without a further ado, what I can do is, so I am into the my Splunk console. So let's try to configure one of the data inputs and let's see whether we are able to do that or not. So what I really wanted to do at the same time, I just wanted to check my connection. Yes, so it's there. And let me clear my screen. So data inputs, I will get into the files and directories. So new, so what I really wanted to do is I really wanted to monitor one of the directories within my instance itself. Okay. So I'm just trying to configure the monitoring for that directory. So I will say where, so that is a directory I really wanted to configure, or probably I can also use browse as an option. So if I go here and if I click on where directory, and I don't want to include anything or something of that sort. Here I will just make it as CyberSec. So this is my host name, and the index I really wanted to keep it to the main. So default is equivalent of the main. If I do that, if I click on submit and start searching, so let's see whether we are getting any kind of the inputs that is being monitored from that directory. So that is wonderful, right? So I am getting the input from that particular directory, and pretty soon I will be having more and more events what we try to monitor from the same directory, right? As you can see that a lot of data has already started getting populated into the Splunk interface. So the next thing I really wanted to do is if I go to the slide, or rather I will go to the command line interface. So we have successfully configured one of the input in terms of monitoring one of the directories for the local Splunk instance, right? So what I did, and as I told you in my presentations, whatever the changes we really made from the Splunk web interface will be that will affect the changes in the configuration files, right? So what I am going to do next is, so let's do pwd. So I am at the root directory, that is fine. So if I say pwd once again, cd opt, that is fine. Let me clear my screen. And if I go to cd etc, if I go to the apps, so I have already told you in the previous sections that under the apps we'll be having our search and reporting app, right? So if I go to my search app, if I try to do ls, you can see these are the directories. If I go into the local directory, sorry about that. If I try to list all the, so you can see that one of the, or rather I will say ls minus lrt. So you can see that just at this point in time, one of the file has gotten created just a minute ago, right? So my time is in UTC, and therefore it is showing me 5:30 hours behind my local time. So that is perfectly fine. So you can see that this particular file has just been created and a minute or two ago, right? So if I really wanted to cat the inputs of this particular file, so you can see that this is what whatever the configuration we have done for the file or directory monitoring using our web interface. So this is the configuration which has gotten affected in our input.conf file. So that's what I really wanted to highlight. Okay. So can you see whatever the changes we do using our REST API, whatever the changes we do using our Splunk web user interface, so all the changes will be getting affected in our conf files. So that's what we say, it's all about managing your conf files when we are talking about Splunk platform, okay? And you can also see that this is the directory which we intended to monitor, which is where directory, and I have explicitly given the name as CyberSecNerd for the host itself, okay? So that's fine. So now for the time being, just assume I do not know whatever the changes that has been affected, right? So now at this point in time, just from the experience, I know, okay, this particular changes will be affected under this particular directory and under inputs.conf, right? If I do not know under which particular directory these changes have been affected under the inputs.conf, can I do that? How will I identify that? What I'm going to do next is, first of all, I really wanted to go to the bin directory. So let me go to the bin directory. So that is fine. So now I'm under the bin directory. Let me clear my screen. So what I'm going to do next is I say Splunk, I would say btool, and I will say input. So this is the name of the file. I will say list. If I try to list all the files, so definitely I'm doing something wrong. Yeah, so I missed out. As you can see that I didn't really spell the name correctly. If I try to list now, you are able to see that I'm able to see all the inputs.conf file So if I really show you in a minute, so all these particular stanzas corresponding to the input.conf file, and you can see that I am really getting lost. Where have I really made a changes? I am not really able to identify. So it's pretty large amount of the data. Let me clear my screen and we will try to run this particular command once again. And only let's try to use the word monitor as a keyword. And if I do that, so now I will be getting little less data, I would say. So for example, whatever the input we have configured as a part of the directory monitoring, only those particular inputs stanzas have come up or dump into my screen, right? So now definitely it is less of the data. And for example, if I really wanted to show you the last configuration which you are able to see here, so this is the configuration which has taken in effect as a form of whatever the input we have configured using user interface. If I go to my screen once again, so here, whatever the input we have configured, that you can see on the console itself, right? So now you can see that these particular three lines have come from the uh, inputs.conf file which we have configured. At the same time, this is a receiving buffer which has come from the default file. Okay. So what we can do is now I will try to make one more change here. Same input and I will say debug as well. So what happens is if I am giving debug as an argument, so now I should be able to see this particular stanzas are coming from which particular conf file and those conf files are residing under which particular directories, right? So for example, that's what I told you. So I really don't want this. So that's what I'm telling you. So now I think I can show you what I really wanted to. So now you can see that this is coming from the system, like, this index is equal to default. This configuration is coming from default system, right? At the same time, I also told you about the receiving buffer. So this is also coming from, you can see that this is also coming from system default inputs.conf. So all the parameters, all the key value pairs are basically getting merged into the one of the conf file, right? So that's what we have looked at in the previous session. Your conf file is really the union of all the inputs.conf file, right? So these two configurations are coming from default, and the remaining three lines you can see that it is coming from app, search, local inputs, right? Disabled is equal to false, and the host whatever we have specified, that is also coming from here. At the same time, you can also see that directory monitoring input is also coming from app search local inputs.conf. So that is how you can really locate the file which has affected changes for, or whatever the configuration we have done on the user interface side. And now in the upcoming slides or upcoming subsequent sessions, I will also be showing you a lot more examples of the B tool. But just to let you know that these are the things which we have already done, and I will show you much more examples of uh, I will show you some more examples of the B tool before we really end our session with respect to the B tool, right? So just stay tuned. I'm going to demonstrate some other examples of the B tool as well. Hello all. In this section, we are going to look at some more examples of the B tool. So without a further ado, let me move on to my console. So this is the query, if you remember from the last session itself. So we are trying to learn more about the DPKG as a source type. So before I do that, I just wanted to show you something. If I try to add data, so I think we have added input in terms of the directory monitoring in the last section. And if you remember, if I try to upload any kind of the data, so I'm just adding a static input. If I say AWS CloudTrail, and if I click on next, now you can see this particular screen and it becomes very important to understand here. So it says the source type, right? So source type, and I can select new source type or automatic, right? So what I will do is I will keep this particular source type as an automatic. So Splunk automatically tries to understand the data which might be there in this particular source type, and therefore the fields will be getting extracted in an intended manner, right? So if you already know the source type, we can select, and we can also give automatic as an option, right? So let me move on. So in the previous screen, so this is the source type, right? Which Splunk automatically tries to learn about this particular source type. So let's try to make a use of the B tool. And if I move back to my terminal, let me try to clear my screen. Now what I'm going to do next is if I say Splunk, I will say btool, and I'm interested in props.conf file, I will say list, and I'm interested in dpkg as a source type, and I will also be passing a parameter as debug. Okay. So if I do that, and if I just need to scroll up because there are a lot of parameters are there. Scrolling up, scrolling up, scrolling up. This becomes little tricky at times. So for example, now if I try to point out to all the sources, you can see that the configuration in the props.conf is coming from the system default, right? So you can see that. But at the same time, if I say so, if the very first line, if you are getting an opportunity to look at what I am showing here, you can see etc apps learned. So under the apps, there is also an app which is called as learned, and we can see that these particular configurations are overridden on the props.conf file from the learned application. That does mean that Splunk automatically tries to learn because of the presence of this application, which is nothing but the learned. At the same time, you should also be able to see in the last line, again, some of the configurations are written from the application, what we call it as learned. So this is one of the scenarios I have covered for the B tool. The second scenario I'm going to cover is, so let me move on to the Splunk. So I will be installing one particular add-on, and if I go to my screen, just a second. So if I ls minus lrt, so now you can see that there is no add-on with respect to the Unix or Nix is present as of now. So what I'm going to do next here is, so if I go back to my here, if I say manage apps, actually I have not really refreshed my screen and that is the reason. So if I click on browse more apps, so let me copy from here. So let me try to find out this particular application. So you can see that this is an application which is already existing. So let's click on open app. So what is the reason here is because probably I didn't do the Splunk restart. I have already uninstalled this application. So what I can do here is, and it should be taking some time, I know. Sorry about that. I think it might take a minute or so. But what I really wanted to make you understand is, so I think the Splunk UI will be going down for some time, for a minute or so. So what we are trying to accomplish is here is, so we are going to install this particular application. And from the btool perspective, we will try to see how the configurations are overridden on each other, right? So that's what we are trying to understand, right? How the configurations are overridden in the configuration files. And we will be looking at mostly the inputs dot configuration file. So if I go back, so now you can see it has prompted me to log in once again. So this is my master username. And hopefully I should be here also. If I try to log in here also, if I try to log in, that should not be a problem. And let us try to copy the application. So now you can see that this particular application is not available. So let me go back to the search and reporting app. So if I go to the app section and find more apps, let's try to install this particular app. And okay, so this is an app. I will be installing this app. Agree and install. Done. So this has already been done. So if I go to my console here and I can clear my screen, if I try to ls minus lrt will be fine. So you can see that the add-on which were not listed here previously, now you should be able to see this particular add-on. So this is the application we have just installed as of now. Okay. If I go to this particular application, Splunk minus ta nix, and let me clear my screen, ls minus lrt. Now you should be able to see that there are certain directories. First thing first, we have got a default directory, but you can see that local directory is not present as of now. Okay. So let's go to the default directory and try to see what are the things, okay? ls minus lrt. So these are the configuration files. We already understood one particular Splunk app is nothing but the collection of the configuration files. So I will try to get into the inputs.conf file. And the important thing to point out here is, so this particular application will be running or executing some of the scripts to collect some of the metrics about the compute or resource utilization with respect to the Unix servers, right? But you can see that this particular inputs are disabled as of now, right? The inputs are disabled as of now. So this is the configuration which exists under the default inputs.conf file, okay? So now what I'm going to do next is, whatever the changes I do as a part of web user interface, those particular things will be end up in the configuration files that we have already understood, right? So if I go here, click on this particular application, and if I try to click on continue the application setup, now what I'm going to do next is I will be enabling all the inputs and I will try to save the configuration. So when I do that, I will be noticing some of the changes. So let's try to go there. And if I see here ls minus LRT. Now you can see that I have also got local directory which has already been created, right? So which were not there previously, right? Let's try to go to the local directory cd local. And if I try to do ls, now you can see that there are two configuration files. Since I have done some changes into the user interface, if I try to look at the inputs.conf, you can see that all the inputs which were disabled in the default inputs.conf is enabled as of now, right? So that's one thing which is important from my perspective. And what I'm going to do next is I just wanted to copy one of the file here. Okay, so let me try to copy this and let me try to exit this. So the same kind of the configuration, if I try to list from the btool perspective, can we do that? So I will say Splunk, then I will say btool, then I am basically looking at inputs.conf file, so that is fine. List, and I am interested here in this particular source type. Okay, so that is fine. Okay, something is wrong here. Okay, so this is fine. Now what I'm going to do next is I'm also going to pass one particular argument which is nothing but debug. So now you can see when there are certain conflicts, how these particular files are merged, right? So I can see that this is coming from default, okay, so that is fine. And what I really wanted to make you understand is the disabled is equal to true, right? So this particular configuration is coming from Splunk nix local inputs.conf. So this is how the configurations are getting merged together and some of the configuration or attributes are getting overridden over each other. So now, I can sufficiently say that, as a part of whatever the changes we make on the our Splunk user interface, so those are getting already reflected in our configuration file. So this is also one of the example if I really wanted to make you understand. So I will see you in the next section uh, where uh, we'll try to understand about the Splunk indexes as well. So I will see you there. Hello, also in this particular section, I just wanted to point out some of the things which we have already done. So if I get back my tool, so for example, we have already reviewed our configuration file. We have a look at sufficient examples how we can utilize btool functionality to retrieve configuration and to analyze conflicts. So the one thing which I didn't do is, for example, how you can use REST API to retrieve a configuration. So I will just, have a 1 minute of the video onto that as well. If there is a need, you can basically utilize this option as well. So what I can do is I can go to my search and reporting application. So for here, if I try to say, this is my REST API, I will say services and I will say properties. So if I click on services and properties, you can see that some of the things which are listed here. So you can see that all the configuration files are listed here. So at this point in time, I'm only interested in props.conf. So let's try to do that. Okay, so now you can see all the stanzas which might be there under the props.conf file. Okay, so I'm only interested in the source type which we are talking about in the previous section, so dpkg. So now you can see that these are the various key value pairs which are associated with that. So let me take an example of max events. So if I say that, if I click on search, you can see that the parameter is being set as, the 256. So this is the default value which is coming for the maximum events, max event. So this is how you can also make a use of your, the REST API as well. So this is what I hello all. In this module or in this section, we are going to look at understanding Splunk indexes. So let's start with that. So if I move to the subsequent slide, so this is the overview which we are going to look at. So for example, let me have my pen and pencil ready. So first of all, we are going to understand the concept how the Splunk stores data. And once we understood that particular part, we'll moving on that knowingly that we know that data is getting stored in the form of the buckets. And then we will see the categorization of these particular buckets. At the same time, in the demonstration, we will be creating an index using the Splunk web, and then we will be analyzing all the configuration files. By the help of the Splunk user interface, we will be effecting some of the changes in the configuration files, and we will be looking at that as well. And then we will also be trying to understand what is the index data integrity check. Okay. So how Splunk organizes the data? So this is the first question that comes into our mind. Probably if you were to understand that probably in one of the SQL databases or the Oracle databases for that matter, but it is not like that, right? So normally the Splunk stores data into your disk of your operating system itself, I would say, uh, or I would say at the disk level of the indexers itself. So it basically stores data in the at the disk level itself in the form of the various indexes. So this is how it is, and I would say Splunk stores data in the form of the indexes, and those particular indexes resides in one of the directories, and those particular files are basically getting stored in the disk. Okay. So now, what are Splunk indexes? We will try to understand what are the Splunk indexes and things of that nature. So so I would say, what is the directory in which Splunk indexes are getting stored? So this is one of the default directory, I would say. Something wrong with my pointer. Okay. So this is the default directory, and Splunk home basically represents OPT Splunk. Okay. So under that, you will go to the where lib Splunk. Under that, you can see what are the various Splunk indexes we do have. Okay. So normally, if you have not really customly created any kind of the index, your data might end up into the index is equal to main. So which is one of the default indexes. So just remember that. And then we also have some of the indexes which are internal in nature. And I would say these are the Splunk internal indexes, right? So indexes contain raw data and index files, and normally administrators do have permission to create indexes, and we will definitely be seeing the demonstration of that. Then, as I was talking about, so we do have some other internal indexes, namely internal audit, and then we also have one more index introspection. So this is just the examples. There are other internal indexes with respect to the Splunk. So whatever the data that is getting stored or resided in the internal indexes, which are started with the underscore, Splunk is not charging for that particular data. So just remember that that doesn't really get through the licensing meter of the Splunk, and therefore no charges corresponding to the internal indexes of the Splunk. Okay. So what do we store under the Splunk indexes? So definitely raw data is raw data or whatever the log files which we do have. So all those particular data will be getting stored in the form of the raw data. And then we also have something known as time series index files. So these particular files are normally representative of the data which is accelerated in the form of the data models. And then we also store some kind of the metadata with respect to some of the sources like the sources.data, source types.data, and host.data. So in this section, as we were talking about how Splunk organizes the data, so now we will be deciphering what does the Splunk buckets mean, where the data actually resides. Okay, so let me move on. So the first slide basically talks about, so indexes store data in the form of the buckets, and we will definitely be talking about what are the different categories of the bucket. Example, hot, warm, cold. So definitely we are going to look at the details of those. And then buckets are set of directories organized by age. So what do we mean by that? By age. So that does mean all the live streaming data that is basically getting stored or written in the hot buckets, and then so probably in 4 hours of the duration or 12 hours of the duration, depending on data retention policies, your data will be getting rolled from the hot to the warm, and from warm bucket to the cold bucket, right? So for example, because at the hot level, you probably have 3 concurrent hot buckets or 10 concurrent hot buckets. If your size exceeds the hot buckets, probably your data will be getting rolled to the warm buckets. And similarly, you have got 300 warm buckets. So I'm just talking about the default indexes.conf file settings. And so once these particular buckets are filled up, probably, the data might be getting rolled to the cold storage. So we use different storage classes. And so for example, for the cold data storage, the data which is seldom getting searched, we can assign a storage class that might be cheaper for the cold storage buckets, I would say, right? So that is an idea, and we will be talking about that as well. And then you can also see that we also have the raw data. We have a time series index data files. So for example, the data models which are accelerated, the data with respect to those data models will be getting stored in the time series index files, and then we also have a metadata corresponding to our data already, right? So as the index grows, the number of the bucket grows as well. So, but I was also talking about some of the default settings, and I will be making it more clear in the subsequent slides. Okay. So types of the bucket. So these are the categorization of the bucket. So, the one is hot bucket, the second is warm bucket, the third is cold bucket. So for example, we normally have 3 concurrent hot buckets or 10 concurrent hot buckets depending on our default settings. And by default configuration says we have got 300 warm buckets, and we can change that particular setting by inducing a customization. And then we have cold buckets, then we have frozen buckets, and we will be talking about the frozen buckets as well. By default, the data under the frozen buckets will automatically be getting deleted, and then we will also be looking at the thawed buckets as well. So let's try to decipher what do we mean by these buckets. So the hot buckets, the important thing is, so the live data which is getting ingested in the Splunk platform, the newest data, so that will be getting stored, or that will be getting written in the hot buckets, right? So they are both read and write buckets, and the data inside the hot buckets are searchable. And there can be more than one hot bucket in an index, and I'm talking about that. So the default setting says, you might have 3 concurrent hot buckets or 10 concurrent hot buckets. So that depends on the size of your indexes as well. And we will try to decipher, where is the configuration, or what are the parameters that is representative of, how many hot buckets can be configured in one of the indexes. Okay. So once your data reaches certain amount of the size, your data will automatically be getting rolled from hot to the warm. So that is something to understand. So for example, your hot buckets might be 750 MB of size. So that also comes from the default settings, and you can also set a 10 GB of the size corresponding to one of the hot buckets. So for the internal indexes, this is the default settings. I am saying for the internal indexes or Splunk internal indexes, this is generally the default configuration. For the indexes, so for example, the main index or all the indexes which have got 2 or 3 terabytes of the data flowing in a day. So for those indexes, normally the bucket size default settings is nothing but the 10 GB of the size. So I am going to make you understand that, and we will also try to get into the our terminal and see how those settings look like. Okay. The second is warm buckets. The warm buckets are created when, so for example, again, so we already know from the hot bucket, the data will be getting rolled to the warm bucket. And as I have shown you, so there so from the default settings, you have got 300 concurrent buckets, which are nothing but the warm buckets. And the important thing to note here is all the data that resides in the warm bucket, that is searchable, but this warm buckets are not really open for writing. That is only for reading the data. So that is something very, very important. So once we have already filled all the 300 concurrent buckets, the data might be getting rolled from the warm bucket to the bucket which are we will be calling it as cold buckets. So that is something important to understand. Okay. So the cold buckets, as I said, so so from the hot buckets, the data will be getting rolled to what we call it as warm buckets. And after the warm buckets, the data will be getting rolled to what we call it as cold buckets. So we normally store the data in the cold buckets that are seldom getting searched. So that are not really searched very often, I would say. And therefore, we can basically make a use of one of the storage class that might be cheaper, right? That might be cheaper because we are not focusing on the performance. So therefore, we can go with one of the storage class, that might not be very performance intensive, but we can really look at from the perspective of in fact saving some cost as well, right? So moving on, then we also have got frozen buckets. The important thing to understand is from the hot bucket, the data is getting rolled to the what we call it as warm bucket. And from warm bucket, the data is getting rolled to what we call cold bucket. So after the cold bucket, if we have not really set something explicitly, the data will automatically be getting rolled to what we call it as frozen buckets. And the default action is to delete that particular data. But we can explicitly configure that particular data to be archived as well. So that is something to be noted and to be considered. Just to archive that particular data, we will be using some of the parameters. The first parameters which we can use is cold to frozen directory. The second is cold to frozen script. So we can archive that particular data, and we can store that particular data, for example, in the S3 buckets as well. All that archive data we can also store in the S3 buckets as well. Moving on. So these are the thought buckets as I make you understand. So frozen buckets can be thought. So we also know that this particular frozen buckets, so the data under the frozen buckets can be stored into the S3 buckets, and from there the data can be thawed as well. And once that particular data is thawed, so that is we meant by that particular thought buckets are again rebuilt into the index. So once that happens, your data will automatically become searchable, and therefore we have, and we can also configure the location or the directory location for these particular thought buckets as well, and we are going to see into the subsequent slides as well. So the bucket location, this is also very, very important. So in our case, the index name. So for example, I already told you if we are not explicitly created any of the indexes, so that is the index that is main. But since we have created, administrators can also create indexes. So now we have created one index which we call it as my first index. So let's try to have a look at that. So from the hot bucket perspective, so this is the hot bucket and this is the warm bucket. So you can see the directory location for these particular buckets, and you can see that Splunk home where lib Splunk is where all the indexes will be getting stored. So under the DB directory, your hot buckets will be getting stored. Under the DB directory, your warm buckets will be getting stored. So only there will be a difference, or there are certain naming conventions we will be talking about in the subsequent slides. But again, you can see that the location of the cold buckets will be slightly different as compared to the hot and warm buckets, and we will be storing data corresponding to the cold buckets under the directory what we call it as cold db. And similarly, the frozen buckets, the data by default is getting deleted, but we can also archive that particular data. So we need to explicitly specify the location of the archive data. We can explicitly configure the location of that particular frozen buckets to be an S3 buckets as well. So that is also a possibility. And then we are also looking at, so if the thought data can be resided under this particular directory, which is nothing but thought db. Okay. Moving on. So as I was talking about the naming convention, now we know that so under the DB directory, we have what we call it as hot bucket, and we also have something what we call it as warm bucket. So now you know that the only distinction we can make between the hot buckets and warm buckets is by the name itself. So you can see that this is the naming convention that is being followed for the hot bucket. So hot v1 and followed by the local ID. So by referring to this particular name, you can understand this we are referencing a hot bucket. And similarly, once the data is getting rolled from hot bucket to the warm bucket, your buckets will be getting renamed, and this is the format which is. So this is nothing but it represents a time format. It also represents the time format in use UTC epoch time in seconds. So you can try to understand that, so this is the newest time and this is the oldest time. So now, by this particular understanding, as you should be able to see, when we explicitly specify the name of the index is equal to main or something else, or when we try to make the use of the time range picker, you know, uh, because now you have the gradual understanding that how the data is getting stored in the Splunk platform. So these particular things becomes very, very important if you are firing any kind of the searches or into the Splunk platform. So if you specify the index name, Splunk knows in which particular directories or the data has to be searched from. And similarly, if you specify the time range, again from the naming convention of the bucket or the directories itself, Splunk will know which particular directories to be searched, right? So that becomes very, very important to optimize the performance of our searches or the SPL queries, okay? So this is just a raw, I would say, this is just one particular snapshot, and I would not be taking much more time here. So directly we can go into creating Splunk indexes. And so now it's time to really look at, why to create multiple indexes, and then post that we will also be seeing the demonstration how to create the indexes into the Splunk and things of that nature. So there are two things for which we create multiple indexes, right? So for example, as I talked about, if we do not create any kind of the index, your data will be getting stored into the default index, which is nothing but the main, right? But we can create multiple indexes, and there might be certain reasons with respect to that. So one reason is security. So for example, if we have created multiple indexes, we can explicitly specify some of the roles. So for example, your security team might be having access to some of the different indexes, and your operations team might be having access to the different indexes, right? So one index might be operations, that might be for the operations team. One index is for the security, so that might be for the security team, right? So that might be one of the classification. So for the security team, we might have some indexes like the AWS security or the network security, things of that nature. So I would not make it complicated at this point in time. Just try to understand when we create multiple indexes, there are two possibilities, right? One, we can easily distinguish the access to the different teams with respect to the multiple indexes, that is security. The second is nothing but the data retention policies. What I'm saying is, if I have one particular index for the operations team, or the web team, I would say, so that particular web data can be stored, I would say, just for the 90 days, and after that the data can be deleted. But for the security team, as the compliance mandates, the data has to be stored for the 365 days. So this kind of the data retention policies we can easily create based on the different indexes as well. So that is what we mean by data retention policies that can be applied at index level. So talking about the security, so from the security perspective, as you can see that this is the file which becomes of the utmost importance. So in the first role, so I have this role my role. So in this role, I'm granting access to some of the indexes, which is nothing but the OS is the index and IDX is one of the index. And if I'm talking about my super user role, I'm also granting access to the OS IDX1 and IDX2. So you can see in my super user role, it has also got access to one more index, that is IDX2. Okay, so this is how we can do the categorization. So super user role has got more access or has got access to the more number of the indexes, I would say, right? So again, the talking about the same thing itself, so you have a default index, and then So the indexes.conf, right? So I already talked about authorization.conf file, so which is from the security perspective. Now, if we were to consider about the data retention policies in the Splunk, so your indexes.conf file will become very, very important, right? So I will try to give you some kind of the information with respect to that. The first thing which I really wanted to make you understand is the first thing I really wanted to make you understand is, so this particular stanza is giving you an information as I already explained in the previous slides. So that the cold data is getting stored in a directory which we call it as cold DB, and it also explains that we have not really configured data integrity control at this point in time. And then you can also understand that this is the location where hot and warm buckets data is residing. So that is something important to understand, and this is nothing but the size of the bucket, right? This is nothing but the size of the index. So this is nothing but, by default one particular index has size of 500 GB. So this is nothing but the default settings what we can consider or what we can understand, and this is a time after which the data is getting deleted from your Splunk platform. So if you can ignore this particular value, if we were to talk about the default value, so it is nothing but the 6 years. So after 6 years the data will be getting deleted from one of the indexes, right? But we can definitely configure this particular setting. So normally if we have data retention policy that we really wanted to keep the data for 90 days, probably I can calculate equivalent of the seconds and put it here. So that is also a possibility. Okay, so that is something to understand, something important to note. So if I clear my screen, thing is happening. Okay. So again, the same thing I'm just trying to make you understand. You can look at some of the directory structure with respect to some of the data, and then I have already made you explain some of the terms like what is the size of the index, and as per the data retention policy, you can also consider frozen time period in seconds. So after those many seconds, your data from your index will be getting deleted. So, without a further ado, the last thing I really wanted to get into the demonstration and to show you how you can really create indexes, and so we will be creating an index from the web itself, and then we will also try to check whatever the changes that has taken an effect in our configuration files. So what I'm going to do is we'll be doing the changes using our web interface, web user interface, I would say. So Splunk Web is coming into picture. So we will be making changes here in the Splunk Web, and henceforth we will be taking into consideration what kind of the changes that have taken effect into our .conf files, right? Configuration files when we create indexes. So let's do that. We will also be trying to understand the data integrity. So for example, just to ensure that whatever the data that has already been stored into one of these Splunk indexes that is not tempered, we can enable a Splunk data integrity control. So we will be looking at that as well. So as I already talked about this particular slide, we have already seen that if we have multiple indexes, we can grant access to those particular indexes based on the team requirements. And similarly, we have already looked at indexes.conf file from the data retention policies. But stay tuned because I'm going to jump to the live demonstration as well. So now is a demo time. So the first thing I'm going to do is I will be logging into my Splunk web platform. I will be creating the indexes, and I will also be looking at what kind of the configuration changes that has taken an effect into my indexes.conf file. So, and I will be uploading a data as well, and then I will try to review the directory structure, and I will try to explain where the data is getting stored in which particular categories of the bucket, and I will also try to configure data integrity control. So just stay tuned with me. So let's look into the demo itself. So what I'm going to do here is so if I go here and if I go to the indexes, I should be able to see what are the indexes that has already been configured in my environment. So you can see that there are a variety of the indexes. So the indexes which are getting started by the underscore itself. So these are nothing but the internal indexes. So this index basically stores all the data, all the users who have logged in into the Splunk. Then you can see that default index size is nothing but the 500 GB of size. So all these particular indexes are nothing but the internal indexes. So if I go down, so this is our main index. You can see that this is our main index where the data is getting stored, since we have not really created a custom index. And for this index also you can see that the index size is nothing but 500 GB, and summary index is nothing. It is representative of our accelerated data models. So I will talk about that in the subsequent sessions, and I will be having some sessions coming for enterprise security as well. So probably I can utilize that opportunity. But for the time being, let me try to create a new index. So I'm saying the name as nothing but the AWS security. So the remaining settings I will be creating, I will be going ahead with the default settings, since I will be storing the events in the AWS security events, and I will not be explicitly specifying the home path, cold path. So I'm keeping all the settings as default. We can also enable data integrity check, because we really wanted to make sure whatever the data that we are storing in our index, that is not really tampered. And so this is the size of the index in GB, so I will not be changing that. Then one more thing I really wanted to point out here is you can see the maximum size of the bucket. So this is auto as of, so auto is nothing but, it says one particular bucket might contain 750 MB of data, right? But we can change that as well. So if we really change that particular setting, your bucket can store 10 GB of the data as well, but this is for the larger indexes. But for smaller indexes, we can go ahead with the default settings as well, which is nothing but auto representative of 750 MB in one of the buckets. So we'll not be specifying the frozen path because we don't really want to archive the data. So, and similarly, I'm just going ahead with the default settings, and I'm creating this particular index in my search and reporting app context level. Okay. So let's click on save. If I go down, you can see that I've created AWS security as an index. So without a further ado, let me move on to my console. So, so now I already told you where the data will be getting resided. So I will go to cd where, I would say lib, I would say Splunk. So if I clear my screen, now you can see that this is the default directory. This is the default directory, So you can see that opt splunk var lib splunk, where all the indexes will be getting stored. So this is the default directory for all the indexes, right? So just remember this particular path. So if I try to do ls, or probably ls minus lrt, I think that should be it. So for example, here I really wanted to emphasize on some of the points which might be important. So now you can see that under this particular directory or this default directory, I have got multiple directories for all the indexes. So for example, for the main index, okay. So for our index is equal to main, this is the directory, okay. Sometimes we also call main index as default also, and I can show you when I try to upload the data. If I get an opportunity, I will show you that. And whatever the index which we have created just now, so this is the index. Index is equal to AWS security. So when we specify index is equal to AWS security in the Splunk web platform in the search and reporting app, so this is how it is, So Splunk automatically searches into this particular directory, and therefore, we always recommend you specify the index name in your searches, and your Splunk searches will be optimized from the basis of performance perspective. Okay. And you can also see other directories which I can really point out. So for example, you can see all the data that is corresponding to the Splunk internal. So this is nothing but the index is equal to internal, and similarly you should be able to see audit as well, and the introspection as well. So where is audit? So you can see a directory corresponding to the audit as well. So moving on. So if I go to my index AWS security, let's try to do that. And if I clear my screen, so here, this is how the directory structure looks like, right? So we have already seen, so ColdDB is nothing but it is corresponding to your cold bucket data. So all the data that is cold will be getting stored under this particular directory. So this is representative of the cold bucket. And then we also have the directory name DB. So this is representative of the hot and the warm bucket. And then we also have something known as a thawed DB. So thawed DB is nothing for the thawed bucket, right? If we have already thawed data from our frozen buckets into the thawed buckets, so those particular data will be residing here in this particular directory. Then we also have something known as data model summary. So the data models which are getting accelerated, so corresponding data will be getting stored into this particular directory as well. Okay. So let's move on to one of the directories. If I go into the DB, you can see that at this point in time, I do not have any data in my index, So what I really wanted to do is if I go to my Splunk platform and let's try to add data. So I will be adding a static data, and I have already shown you how you can configure uh, an input corresponding to monitoring directories. So upload a data. So here I'm just going to add a static input. That's it. Select a file. So I'll be saying AWS CloudTrail. Okay, going to the next. I've already explained you the consequences or references with respect to the automatic source type. So here, let me put it like CyberSecNerd. And here I told you that if I got an opportunity, I will show you. So the default index is nothing but corresponding to the main index itself. So by default, if I do not specify the index, the data will be getting stored into the main index. But I do not want that configuration, and because of that, so I have created a index already. That is nothing but the AWS security. So let's go ahead with that. Submit. So that doesn't really have a lot of data, and if I click on start searching, I will be having data corresponding to that. So that's it. I have already got events corresponding to my data. So now what I really want is I just wanted to go here. If I go here and if I say ls, so these are the directories, db, if I say ls, so now you can see that, or I can do ls minus lrt. So that's what I really wanted to. So we have already looked at the naming convention of the buckets, and from the naming convention of the bucket, you understand that we are really looking at hot data. So I already told you that in the hot buckets, the data which is getting live streamed or getting ingested into the Splunk platform is getting stored into the hot buckets. And so hot buckets are pretty less in numbers. So hot buckets are always uh, there might be 3 concurrent buckets corresponding to the indexes which are smaller in size, and for the larger indexes there might be 10 concurrent hot buckets for the larger indexes, which is responsible for storing larger amount of the data, right? So just remember that. So once we already filled this 3 buckets or 10 buckets which are nothing but hot, the data will automatically be getting rolled to the what we call it as warm buckets. Okay, so that's it. So if I go to, let's say, let's try to look at the configuration also. So I just wanted to give you some other details as well. So what I can do is I can clear my screen and again run my command. That is fine. So some of the important things, we already talked about the metadata. So these particular directories store so it stores raw data. We already discussed about the raw data. It stores raw data. It also stores a data corresponding to the metadata of the sources. So for example, host, sources and source type data. Then we also, for example, now you can see a lot of, so the raw data will be getting stored in this particular directory, and then you can also see a time series index files. So these particular files will be storing data corresponding to data models which are accelerated. Okay, so if I go to raw data, if I try to do ls, so now I just wanted to give you one more. So the raw data will basically be getting stored into this particular directory, which represents journal.gz. The data is getting stored into the compressed format into the Splunk in the form of the flat file. So this is what I really wanted to show you. Excuse me. So yeah, so just give me a second. So guys, before I really conclude this particular session, I also wanted to emphasize on data integrity as well, index data integrity. So what I really I can do is I can go back to my terminal, and now what I can do is let me come out first. So okay, this is where directory. So what I can do is I can go to the bin directory and then Splunk and then check. So this is the command. So I'm going to use a check integrity command, check integrity. So there is a typo, and I will be specifying my index name and AWS security. Okay, there is again a typo. Let me clear my screen. Something is. So, okay. So I think again we have got certain typos. So just let me fix this. Okay. So now I think I have got the command back, and you can see that. So this is what happens, so I have already got the result back. You can see that I've already checked the data integrity. So the data which we are storing into our AWS security index, that is not really tempered, and we have already checked the hash or with the help of this particular function. So that is one of the use case if you really integrate or you enable a data integrity into one of your indexes, right? So I will be seeing you in the next session, which basically talks about configuring indexes, and I will be showing you some other stuff with respect to the indexes.conf file, and I will see you there in the next section. Hello all. In this section we are going to look at configuring indexes. So let's get started. So in the overview, I will be showing you the utility of the indexes.conf file. We will also try to understand the fish bucket, and we will also try to apply a data retention policy again with the use of the indexes.conf file. And then I will show you some of the management related functions with respect to the Splunk index. For example, how to take backups, deleting events, cleaning out, and things of that nature. And we will also try to explore monitoring console in a bit. Okay. So now moving on to the Splunk index configuration file. As I said that, uh, for us, it becomes very important. So what has become most important is this file, right? Index.conf file. So we will try to explore all the minute details with respect to the indexes.conf file. So let us move on. So starting with the location of the indexes.conf file. So like any other configuration file, this particular file should be there here in the system default, but we should not be making any changes here. We should rather make changes to the system. And if I go to the local directory, and again, I will be having indexes.conf file, right? So moving on. So just a caution, do not edit this file, and we can create a new file. At the same time, there is one more alternative as you can see on my screen. So we can also have that particular conf file under one of the applications which we have installed under the apps directory. So any third party application or add-on we install, that goes to the application directory, and under that application we can have a local directory. Under that we can store indexes.conf file. Okay. So moving on, and as having said that, we will be requiring a Splunk Dir restart if we were to make any kind of the changes to the configuration files, right? So now it's a time to look at the structure of the indexes.conf file. So there might be stanzas which might be limited to certain stanzas itself, but we can also describe or define global parameters which might be applicable to all the stanzas, meaning it might be applicable to all the indexes or all the source types in general, right? And we have already looked at how we can really resolve a conflict and what is the precedence and things of that nature. We have already covered those particular things in the previous sections. So this is how the structure of the files look like. So let me try to explain you in a bit. So for this is the name of the index. So for example, this is the name of the index. So we can have, so for example, if we have the index is equal to main, it will be written like that in the square brackets. So now what happens is you can see that this is the directory which corresponds to the hot bucket as well as warm bucket, right? The only how do we distinguish between the hot bucket and the warm bucket? With the help of the naming convention itself. Here we will be storing the cold buckets. Here we will be having a thawed buckets. And here, as I said, all the data or all the data with respect to the data models, which is accelerated, will be getting stored in the summary indexes, or I would say this particular location in the directory, right? And then we have this particular parameter. So after these many seconds, our data in our environment will be getting moved to the frozen bucket. So default, when the data is getting rolled to the frozen bucket, by default, we means it is deleted. If we were to specify explicitly whether the data has to be archived somewhere, so I will come to that in a bit. So the same thing, I think some of the parameters I really wanted to make you understand a bit more. So we have covered this, that is fine. We have covered this, we have covered this, we have covered this. We have also covered this. So this is the duration of the time. So by this, by default setting is your data after the 6 years of the duration will be getting moved to the frozen bucket, meaning deleted, right? But we can configure this particular setting as per our need. So for example, 90 days, the data will be getting moved to the frozen bucket or things of that nature, right? Now, now this particular parameter indicates that we have three concurrent hot buckets. And after that, once the data has already filled up in these three concurrent buckets, the data will be getting rolled to the warm buckets. Okay. And this particular setting indicates the size of the hot bucket or size of the buckets, which is equivalent of 750 MB. We can also change this particular parameter. So if we were to make changes of this particular parameter to the auto volume, so that should be applicable to the large indexes, and that by this particular parameter, one particular bucket can store up to 10 GB of that data. Okay. And so this is corresponding, one particular index can store how many? So 400 GBs of the data in one particular index. Okay. And this is the count of the warm buckets. So 300 warm buckets are already there. So once all these particular buckets are filled up, the data will be getting rolled to the cold bucket. Okay. So moving on. So I think I've covered all this. So probably, yeah. So the time to understand the fish bucket index, and it is also very one important concept, right? So the first thing I really wanted to point out is the fish bucket index keeps track of the ingestion in progress. So therefore, with the help of the fish bucket index, we can re-index some kind of the data if we fail to. We can re-index that particular data if we really want to, because it keeps track of the ingestion progress. Okay. And you can also see the location of the fish bucket index. So it is again at the same place as that of the other indexes under the var lib splunk directory. Okay. So the very first utility, the very prominent utility I would say with respect to the fish bucket index should be to reindex a particular file. And you can see that this is the command which we can use to reindex that particular data. And I will show you the real one particular demonstration of that as well. And apart from that, you can also reindex all the monitored files as well, but it is not one of the major use case with respect to the fish bucket index. Okay. So now we will talk about the data retention policy. And as we know, with respect to the data retention policy, our indexes.conf file has become very, very important, and we have been trying to learn a lot of parameters with respect to the indexes.conf file. So we have discovered about this particular attribute, meaning how much duration the data will be rolled to the frozen bucket. This is the size of the index. And so there are certain important things to note in this particular slide as well. So the retention policy will be applied at the index level, namely main, and we have also seen one particular index like AWS security and things of that nature. Okay. Configuring data retention. So just wanted to point out some other things. So as I have already discussed, by default, the data will be getting stored 6 years before it is getting rolled out to the frozen buckets, right? But we can change this particular parameter. So normally, some of the organizations have a 90 days retention policy. So beyond that, I can convert this 90 days into the equivalent of the seconds, and then I can change that particular attribute so that data will be getting deleted after 90 days of the duration, right? At the same time, this particular attribute, we are defining the size of the index, which is equivalent to the 500 GB. So we are talking about the default settings. So now I will be taking an opportunity to discuss about, so as you know that data is getting rolled from the hot bucket to the warm bucket and then to the cold bucket and then to the frozen bucket and then to the thawed bucket, right? So this is the normal flow. So we can also configure cold frozen script. So there are two ways I can configure if data were to move to the frozen buckets. So by default, what happens is data is getting deleted, right? Once it is getting rolled from the cold to the frozen bucket. So this is the default behavior. But if I want this data to be archived, then I can use two parameters. One is this one, which is nothing but the cold frozen script. The second attribute is cold frozen directory. And if I am making the use of these two parameters, when I'm trying to roll data from the cold to the frozen buckets, my data will be getting archived to a certain location. I can archive that particular data to the S3 buckets as well. Okay. Just remember this particular thing. And once the data is archived, if I really wanted to restore that particular data, what I can do is I can roll this particular data from the frozen bucket to the thawed bucket, and then I will try to rebuild the index with the help of the below command. Okay. So this is the command I will be using to rebuild the index using the thawed buckets. Okay. So managing Splunk indexes, I will be covering some of the basic features. So for example, these are just do's and don'ts. So for example, we can take incremental backups, and from the backups point of view, the most important things is we should be taking the backups of the warm and cold buckets, and we should be taking the backup of the etc directory where the configuration files are getting stored. And in that distributed environment, we already know that the entire data is getting replicated between the indexes. So this is certain do's and don'ts with respect to the delete. We can also write off events with respect to the certain indexes. So that's not a problem. So administrators can do that. So for the administrators, we are basically looking at can delete capability. So we can grant can delete capability access to the admins in general, and then we should be able to perform this particular function. So when we perform a delete operation, the data is getting written off the index, so it's still there at the index level, but it will no longer be searchable. Okay. So again, some do's and don'ts with respect to the cleaning out a Splunk index, but this is not really recommended. Always try to expire that particular data. And this is an extremely dangerous command, and I would not recommend to use this particular command, but for the FYI basis, I'm including this for the comprehensiveness. So in the next demonstration or in the subsequent section, I will be looking at all this particular thing. So what I'm going to demonstrate in the next section is, so we will be doing the live demonstration, how we can configure a data retention policy. We will try to review the indexes.configuration file. We will also be reviewing location and contents of the fish bucket index, and we will be deleting events as well, and I will also give you some example or use case with respect to the monitoring console from the indexer standpoint as well. Indexers, right? How we can monitor indexers using the monitoring console. So stay tuned with me for the next section. Hello all. As promised in this particular section, we are going to look at the indexes.conf file and we will be configuring a data retention policy. We are going to review the location and the contents of the fish bucket index, and we will be resetting a fish bucket index to re-index that particular data, and we will be deleting some of the events from an index, and I will also try to make you explore some of the monitoring console utilities as well. So without a further ado, let me get started. So let me move on to my console, which is here. So the first thing I'm going to do is if I go back to my terminal, what I really wanted to show you here is, so if I come out and cd etc, okay, so if I clear my screen, I need to go to the system, I need to go to the default, right? So now if ls minus lrt, so if I try to list all the files, there should be one particular file indexes.conf. So this is the file which we are interested in, less indexes.conf. So this is the file. So the first thing I really wanted to point out here is, so you should not be updating this particular file because all the files under the default directory will be getting rewritten when there is a Splunk upgrade. So therefore, do not make any kind of the changes under the default directory. Just a word of the caution. So now you can see that all these particular parameters which you are able to see here, these are the global parameters. These are not really restricted to one particular stanza, right? So these are applicable to all the indexes and source types in general, right? So for example, again, you can see these particular parameters already, and definitely we will be having so for example, you can see this is the value, right? So all the size of the index is nothing but the 500 GB in size. So that particular data is coming from this particular attribute itself. And similarly, there are a lot many attributes I can show at this point in time. But if I try to scroll down, and I would like you to emphasize on some of the main indexes as well. So now you can see that whatever the parameters I define here, that should only be applicable to my main index or main stanza, right? So the first thing I really wanted to point out here is, so there are certain important things. So now I would like to take an opportunity to explain some of these stuff. So for example, you can see that maximum hot buckets, right? Since our main index will be having most of the data getting ingested into the main Splunk, and therefore we should have a larger size of this particular index, and we are saying that we will have a 10 concurrent hot buckets, and this is the concurrent hot buckets for this particular index in general. But for the smaller indexes, we normally have 3 concurrent hot buckets, right? And you can also see the max data size, which is nothing but the auto high volume. So this particular thing indicates that we have one particular hot bucket can store 10 GB of the data, something of that nature, right? But for the smaller indexes, we normally have 750 MB of data. So these are the some of the settings or attributes which only correspond to the main index in general, which is a large index which stores a lot of data, and therefore we have this kind of the settings in general. Also notice one more thing, that we do not really have frozen time seconds here. So that frozen time seconds will definitely be coming from the default settings. I would like to emphasize enough. Okay, so let me try to quit from here. And what I am going to do next is, if I go to the local setting, I want to show you the index which we have created in the previous section, ls-lrt. So these are the files, right? So of course, under the local directory, I'm not really able to see indexes.conf file, so no problem at all. So if I try to the system, so guys, just give me a second. So now I think just let me clear my screen. So actually I'm looking for a file. So since I have already defined or created an index in search and reporting context, so let's move on to there. So I will be moving here, cd apps, and I will say search. Okay, now if I do ls, okay, now I am able to find the local directory as well. So that is fine. If ls minus lrt, okay, so now you can see my indexes.conf file. If I really go to the indexes.conf file, so this is where I have really defined my index. So this is the index which we have defined, if you remember in the previous section. So now you can really look at, what is coming from. So we have definitely enabled our data integrity control, right? Data integrity control, so that data cannot be tampered in our index. And then you can see that this is my home path, which has already been defined, and the last lot of the settings will be coming from the default settings as well. So if you see my frozen time seconds is not really defined, so it should be so the frozen time second will be one particular attribute that should be taken as a part of my the default parameters only, right? So what I really wanted to say is, if I try to quit here, so what I can do here is, so I will say Splunk, I will say btool, I will say I'm only interested in the indexes.conf file, and I will say list. And here I am only interested in the AWS security index and debug. So if I say so, now you are able to see that there are a lot of configuration that are coming from, if you can see, a lot of configurations are coming from system default indexes, but let's try to see that there should be other configurations. For example, now I can see that this is the configuration which is coming from search local indexes as well, right? So let's try to scroll a little bit up as well. And there might be some of the interesting attributes as well. So now you can see that I have already defined AWS security as an index, and so there are certain things which are coming from this particular index also, right? So what I can do next here is I can run this particular command and try to look for. So here, if I say grep frozen, so now you can see that this is the attribute, or probably, I can clear my screen so that it will offer you the good visibility. So that's it. So what I'm saying here is, so I'm interested where this particular attribute is defined. So whether it is coming from the global stanza or it is coming from the one particular index which I have defined specifically or explicitly, right? So when I look at this particular directory, which is nothing but etc system default indexes, so I can see that this frozen time period in seconds, this attribute is coming from the global stanza in general, and this particular value is nothing but the 6 years, right? Equivalent of the seconds, right? So my data into the AWS security index will be getting rolled to the frozen bucket in general after 6 years of the duration. So I can really customize this particular attribute as well. What I can do here is I can I can take this particular attribute, and so here, so now what I can do is I just need to make this particular changes. So for example, if I say vi indexes.conf, so this is my directory. So if I go into the insert mode, so this is my insert mode, and I just need to paste this particular attribute, right? So if I go to the end, so here, so I can really modify this particular attribute in terms of the 90 days. I just need to calculate 90 days into the seconds. For example, if I say 90 days in seconds, so okay. So, I can just calculate this particular second. So this is how it is. So this is the attribute, I can just take and I can just define it here. And of course, I don't need commas here. So this is equivalent of the 90 days. So I can make this particular changes here. And I would say escape WQ. So that is done. Now I just need to restart my Splunk as a process itself and my work is done, right? So that's it. Hello all, in this section we are going to look at two different things. The first thing is we have already covered indexes.conf file and data retention policy. We are going to look at the fishbucket index, and then we will also try to delete an event from an index, how to write off that particular event from the index so that it will no longer be searchable. That is also one of the thing. And then we will also look at monitoring console use case from the perspective of the indexes as well, right? Let's try to start without a further ado. So if I go back to my console itself, what I'm trying to do here is, so if I really wanted to delete one particular event, so for example, I'm just trying to search a random event. So for example, if I remove this particular case, you should be able to see that I have got lot of events with respect to this particular source or source type in general, but I'm trying to search for one particular event only, right? So if I really wanted to delete this particular event, so let's start with that, and then I will tell you about the fish bucket index in general. So if I say so, come on. So the result has come. You can see that I have got only one particular event. If I really wanted to delete this particular event, I may not be able to do that. So for example, you can see error in delete command. You have insufficient privileges. What I can do here is I can go to the where are roles, right? I can go to the roles. I can grant certain permissions for my admin role. So for example, if I go to the admin function, you can see that I can grant can delete capability access to the admin role. So anybody who has got the administrator role should be able to perform that particular function. So if I go to the search and reporting app once again, and now I need to go to the search history once again. So I think if I add to this search, so for example, before I do that, let's try to search this particular event. So I need to really make it all time because I am using a public data set in general. And now I have got one particular event. So if I try to delete this particular event, so now you can see that I have got the intended result. So two things. So when I try to use this particular function, this particular data is already there in our index, right? So data is there in the index. We have written off that particular data in the index, right? So what does that mean? That this particular event is no longer searchable. So the data is there at the index level only, but it is no longer searchable. So that is what we mean by when we perform a delete function, right? So for example, if I go back and if I try to search this particular event, let's see whether we have come back with any results or not. So we haven't. So now, second thing I really wanted to show is the fish bucket index. So time to move on to my terminal. And so I am here in the where lib Splunk. If I try to do ls minus lrt, you can see the fish bucket is already listed at the very last. If I go to my fish bucket index, so this is how it is. And let me clear my screen. So you can see that the structure of the directories pretty much look like any other indexes which we have already seen, right? But we can also see there is Splunk private DB. So it basically tracks changes with respect to what kind of the data that is being ingested in Splunk if we really wanted to reindex that particular data. So the structure wise it looks same. So we normally use fish bucket index for the forwarders, right? For the universal forwarders to re-index certain kind of the events from the universal forwarders. We normally do not use this particular command at the indexer level. So just a word of caution there, right? That's what I really wanted to mention about the fish bucket index. Now, without a further ado, let me move on to my monitoring console. If I go into the settings, you can see the monitoring console here. In the monitoring console from the indexing point, if you go to the indexes and volumes, and if you see the index detail or indexes and volume instances, so that's what I really wanted to show you. So here you should be able to see you are able to see all the indexes in general. So these are our indexes. You can see that I have created security index and AWS security index. For all those index, we have given the index size, which is nothing but the 500 GB. And you can also see the capacity of that particular index, and you can also see that how many events we are ingesting in those particular indexes as well, right? And so since I have ingested that particular data today itself, you are able to see the age of this particular index, which is nothing but 0 because I have ingested that particular data today itself. And now if I scroll to the right hand side, so currently, because I think I have just ingested data, it is not really showing, but in the main index, you should be able to see the number of the events which are listed here in the index level or the main index. Similarly, you should be able to see the total number of the events in the internal indexes as well, and the bucket counts as well, right? So you can see the concurrent buckets at the internal indexes is 3, which is coming from the default settings. And for the main indexes, which is pretty much large in size, you can see there are 30 hot buckets there, right? So that's what I really wanted to show you. And you can also look at some other parameters. So for example, if I really wanted to click on one of the indexes, if I click on the main index, you should be able to see some other metrics which might give you some other utility as well. So go to this particular page, it might give you a lot of results which might be useful. So for example, if you are able to see that a lot of events or a lot of the rogue data that is getting dumped into your console, you should be able to identify here in this particular console itself. If I go to my presentation once again, so I just wanted to summarize. So congratulations that you have completed this Splunk administration course successfully. And I would like to mention two things because we have already completed this particular course. Always have a look at my YouTube video description box. Why? Because I have two things, right? So one important thing which I have is timeline so that you can follow whatever I have demonstrated and you can utilize this particular timeline, whatever the content I have covered in the entire video course. And the second thing is I'm always pointing to my GitHub pages as well, right? So GitHub page also includes SPL queries. If I'm using any kind of the SPL queries, like in the previous course, you should be able to find all the SPL queries for my courses. At the same time, I'm also uploading some kind of the PDF document in my GitHub pages as a reference, so you can also use those particular resources in general, right? So this, I just wanted to make sure that you know this kind of the things. So first thing first, we have covered licensing option and how to handle license violations. Then we also look at the configuration files and how does the precedence look like. And then we have covered the btool as one of the functionality for the Splunk administration guys, and how to make our jobs easier with the help of the btool in terms of the troubleshooting. And then we also looked at how to create various indexes and how we can set the data retention policies and security at the index levels. We have also tried to explain the Splunk data buckets, including the hot, warm, and cold. We also try to configure data retention policy using indexes.conf file. And then we also try to look at managing Splunk indexes, whether it is backups, whether it is, the cleaning of the indexes and deleting of the indexes, how data can be written off. All these particular things which we have completed. And I would say thank you once again. And so I will see you in the next.